Looking for the best wooden knitting needles? I've got them right here. I've tested many brands and styles of wooden knitting needles, and these are my all-time favorites. Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and if you've been watching my knitting videos for a while, chances are you've probably seen me knit with these needles. Over the years that I've been knitting, I have tested out a bunch of different styles and brands of wooden knitting needles. Some were okay, some were just not that great, and a few were really nice. But of all the wooden knitting needles that I've tried, these laminated birch knitting needles from Knit Picks are the very best, and I'd love to show you why. So first off, I should mention that I purchased every pair of Knit Picks knitting needles you see here with my own money. They did not pay me to make this video. They did not even ask me to make this video. I just really enjoy working with these needles, and I want to share why I love them so much. So Knit Picks carries a full line of laminated birch knitting needles, and they call these Knit Picks Options birch knitting needles. And all of these needles are made from laminated birch. So here is a needle tip, for example, and they are very high quality. They come in multiple different color combinations, and of course they have custom cases for them and everything. So let's look at why these needles are the best. So in my opinion, a good quality knitting needle should be lightweight with sharp tips, flexible cords if they are the circular variety. They should have a slick, smooth surface with as little friction as possible because I like to knit relatively quickly and you don't want your stitches dragging along the needle. And they should not have any paint or markings that can rub off or areas where the stitches are likely to get caught as you're knitting. So these tick all of those boxes, and I've actually been using these needles, not every pair of these needles, but this line of needles I should say, for over 7 years, and I have loved using them so much. So let's talk about why laminated birch is the best wood for knitting needles. So of course, laminated birch needles have the opportunity to be layered with all of these colors in them because of the way that they are constructed. But the most important thing to me in any knitting needle is the surface friction. And this is especially a problem for wood because a lot of wooden knitting needles, especially bamboo is one of the highest friction knitting needles to work with. But a lot of wooden knitting needles have significantly more friction than some of the more slippery options like metal. My favorite metal knitting needles are stainless steel. I have a separate video on those needles if you want to check that out. But I love a smooth, slick knitting needle. And that's because when you work with a smooth knitting needle, it allows the stitches to glide across the needles so smoothly that it just kind of like goes in and out of the stitches like butter. And that makes it so pleasant to knit with, especially because it doesn't slow you down and the stitches do not drag along the needle as you're working. So you don't have to shove them so hard to get them to scoot along the needle. You can just slide them along the needle. And that is the main reason why I feel that laminated birch is the best wood for a knitting needle. I've tried other exotic wood interchangeable needles, and of all the wooden knitting needles I've tried, even the ones with a coating, I've never found one with a coating as slick as this one. This is the best coating I've ever been able to find on a knitting needle. Now, another thing about wooden knitting needles is that they feel very warm against your skin. And that's something that a lot of people really enjoy when they're working with a needle, to not have the cold feeling of metal in their hands. Of course, metal will warm up to your hands as you work with it, but wooden knitting needles are already warmed up to your hands. You don't have to work with them a while before they feel warm, and that is one perk of a wooden needle. Another one is that they don't clank together as you knit like metal needles. So they do make a little bit of sound, especially the big ones. Let's try a smaller pair so you can get an idea of what that sounds like. So if you can hear that, let me put it up closer. They can make a little bit of noise as you knit with them, but it's very quiet compared to that constant scraping, clanking kind of noise that you get with a metal knitting needle. All right, so now let's look at the tips of these needles. These are standard tip style knitting needles, so they're not like a lace tip that has a longer taper to it. But for a standard style knitting needle tip, these are pretty sharp and they go into the stitches very nicely. And they do have just a little bit on the very, very point of the needle. They're rounded just a tiny bit so that they don't split your yarn. Of course, it's still possible for a yarn to split depending on how it's spun, but then you don't have the problem with the needles splitting the yarn on their own because of that slightly rounded tip. If you can kind of see how that's rounded off, but the tip itself, the way that it tapers, is still very sharp and smooth. So now let's look at the cords. The cords of a needle are a very important part of your needle collection, especially if you work with circular needles often. Because if you are dealing with a low quality circular knitting needle cord, then what happens is as you're knitting, and I've experienced this with cheap needles before, the cord will kind of twist up on itself because it's been packaged rolled up like this. And who knows how long it was in the package curled up like that before you got it. Chances are pretty good that you have to store them like this because, you know, most cases are designed to store the cords of your knitting needles rolled up. So with a cheap quality knitting needle cable, when they're stored like this, then when you go to use them, they want to retain that shape. And so then when you knit with them, they're constantly trying to loop over themselves. And with a memory-free cord, this does not happen. So a memory-free cord is designed to be round, like this. But it's not going to coil itself up when you're trying to knit with it. Now, of course, it can when you go to flip your knitting over, and you're basically flipping the whole thing and switching needles from one hand to the other, it can loop. But it doesn't like naturally want to do that as you are knitting with it most of the time. So that is why a memory-free cable is really important with a circular knitting needle. So now let's look at the size markings. Now, of course, I have multiple styles of knitting needles here, but let's look at the size markings on this one. So with the circular, interchangeable circular needles, I don't know if you can see that because of the reflection of my lights, but the sizes are kind of etched onto the metal. And the same goes with this needle right here. It's, of course, a smaller print because it's a smaller place to print it, but it's etched on there. So you can barely feel the texture of that text on the metal, but because it's etched on there, you know that it will not rub off. Because sometimes with different types of knitting needles, whether they be wood or metal, I've seen this, and it's not a good thing, they'll paint or stamp with paint or ink the needle size marking onto the wood or onto the metal, and that will rub off over time. Any kind of painted on surface on a knitting needle will rub off over time, whether it be from the needles scraping against each other as you're working, or from your hands or from the stitches, it will rub off if it's painted. So although these size markings are kind of small, because they have to be, it's just the nature of this type of needle, they are etched onto the metal here, which is definitely better than the alternative, which is being painted on. And because this is an interchangeable needle, it has to have a metal connection. You can't make a little wooden screw hole here for the connection to go into the cable. So there has to be a metal connection here, and this is one of the most high quality connections that I've seen. Not because the metal is like super heavy or something, but because of how nicely and how seamlessly they have made these two materials fit together. I've tried other knitting needles that have a material change from the connector to the shaft, and some of the other ones that I've tried, I could feel the difference when sliding the stitches across because there was a little bitty tiny groove there where the seam is between those two materials, and that does not make your knitting experience ideal. So this has one of the best joins from the connection to the wooden needle shaft of any knitting needle that I've tried. So let's look at the size markings on the other needles. The double-pointed needles do not have a size marking, which is, I think, a good thing, because with double-pointed knitting needles, you're going to have stitches along the entire part of the needle here all the time. This whole surface needs to slide easily. If they were to paint on a size marking here, it would rub off. If they were to etch it onto the wood, it would snag the yarn. So for double pointed knitting needles, I think it is better to have the sizes unmarked like this, and then you can just use a needle sizer to determine which one is which, or store them in little labeled pouches to know which size is which. So no, the DPNs do not have a marking, but that is actually pretty common, and that is my preference for DPNs. Now we've got one more to look at here, and that is the straight needle. And with the straight needles, they have a stopper here, and you're not going to have to run yarn across this. So these markings are painted on, but that's not a problem here because this right here is not an area that's going to be rubbing up against anything. So a painted on marking on the end of a needle like this will last far longer than a painted marking on any of these other types of needles. So this is the straight needle version. It's not a problem for the size to be painted on for this one. So now let's look at the way that these needles connect to their cord. So I'm going to go ahead and connect. I'm going to grab a larger needle here, and I'm going to connect it to a cord so that you can kind of get an idea of how the yarn flows up the needle shaft, or up onto the needle shaft. So we'll talk about these cord keys in a minute, but this is how you tighten your connection here so that it doesn't come unscrewed while you're knitting. But if you look at the way that this is shaped, you can see how that there is a very nice gradual, smooth path here for the stitches to travel up to get to the shaft of the needle. Now, is it totally impossible for a stitch to ever get caught as it moves up? No, but with the nature of these types of needles, that's not really realistic anyway, because the stitches do have to go over multiple bumps, so to speak, to get up on the needle. They have smoothed out those bumps very, very nicely, where that any stitches having trouble getting up over there is going to be very minimal, unless you have tight tension. But compared to some other knitting needle connections of other needles that I've tested, these do have a very nice smooth connection here with minimal snagging on the way up to the needle shaft. Alright, so let's look at what types of needles are available in this collection. So first up is my favorite, the interchangeable circulars. I only have one tip attached to this one right now, but interchangeable circulars have a long flexible cord in the middle here and two needle tips so that you can knit in the round. And these are the most versatile because you can use interchangeable circulars to knit in the round, to knit flat, to knit small circumferences with a technique called magic loop. There's also another technique commonly used for socks where you use two circular needles together, and you can use an interchangeable circular knitting needle to knit anything you want. And this is great if you want to make a really large project as well, because if you were trying to knit a blanket, for example, and you want to knit a queen size blanket, with straight needles, you can only fit as many stitches on your piece as what will fit on this length of needle. So you're kind of limited to how big of a project you can make with a straight needle like this one with the stopper on the end. Whereas with a circular knitting needle, you can make a piece as big as you want because you can connect these cables together with these little cord connectors to make longer and longer and longer cords. So you could totally knit an entire very, very large blanket in one piece with a circular knitting needle. Now, they do offer fixed circular knitting needles, which means that the cord is permanently attached to the needle tip, but I like the interchangeable ones better because with an interchangeable circular, you only have to have one set of tips in each size and several cords to have a complete collection. Whereas with fixed circulars, you may not always have the right size circular that you need for your project because you would have to have, this is a size 11, you'd have to have a size 11 circular knitting needle in a 24 inch, a 32 inch, and multiple lengths for each size. Whereas with an interchangeable needle, you can have one set of tips for each size and then just swap out the cords whenever you need to. Now, it is sort of common for people to have problems with their interchangeable needle tips coming disconnected from the cord, but that's not actually the fault of the needles. If you use these little cord keys to tighten that connection, then that's never going to be a problem, and I'll show you in more detail how to do that later in the video. So the next style of needles I want to look at is the short interchangeable circular knitting needles. So these have a much shorter needle shaft so that you can put those needles on a much shorter cable and knit small items like hats and sleeves in the round without using double pointed needles. And I much prefer using a circular over double pointed needles anyway, so I am all for using shorter circular knitting needles. Now, not only do they have short versions of the interchangeable circulars, they also have a square version, and this is actually a combo. This is the short square version. And if you can kind of see that, I don't know how easy that is to see on camera, but this needle has a square shaft with 4 flat sides instead of a round shaft. And what that does, this is not a necessity by any means, but some people prefer a needle with a square shaft because they feel that it helps them grasp the needle more easily. Now, I personally don't have a problem grasping the round ones, so either way, it doesn't really matter to me if they're square or round, but if you prefer a square knitting needle, then they do have that option, and they make the square ones in both the short interchangeable tips and the regular size interchangeable tips. Now, one thing that you need to know about the short interchangeable needles is that although you can use the short tips on any length of a cable, you cannot use the short cables, the 16-inch cables, with the longer tips. And that is because when you do that, if I were to hold them like I had them connected here, the tips of the needles have to be put under more tension to make that circle because of how short the cord is. And so they are slightly more likely to break. I've never had a needle break, but I've also never tried to use it with the very, very short cords with the longer tips. So they do not recommend using the longer tips with the short cables because of that slightly increased possibility of breaking them. So if you enjoy working with shorter tips, especially if you have smaller hands, these are a little harder to work with if you have larger hands, I think. But if you enjoy working with shorter tips and you want to be as budget friendly as possible, then you could totally go for the short needle tips and just buy extra cables in the longer lengths and still have a full set of circular needles. So next up on the list is the straight needles. Now, I have owned these straight needles for a very long time, but I ended up buying them around the same time that I bought my full set of interchangeable circulars, and most of the time I use interchangeable circulars. So I don't actually use these very often. They do have the same smooth feel and the same tips, and they feel the same to work with them. But I typically go for the interchangeable circulars because they're more versatile and I think they're more comfortable to work with, because with a straight needle, you also have to support the weight of your project that's sticking out back here and not just the weight of the project that's under your hand. Whereas with an interchangeable circular, your hand is only holding up the weight of what's directly under your hand, and the cord can kind of puddle in your lap and hold the rest of the project that way. So in general, I always go for circular knitting needles for almost every project, but if you prefer working with straight knitting needles, they do have that option, and they are very, very nice quality, smooth, straight knitting needles. So I would definitely recommend these if that is your preference. Now, next up we have DPNs, or double pointed needles, and these are typically used for knitting smaller circumference projects in the round, and their knitting needles, their DPNs, usually come in sets of 5, so that you can have 4, see if I can kind of hold this together without any stitches on it, you can have 4 knitting needles that make up your round, that hold all the stitches on your round, and then you have the 5th one to knit with. So their double pointed knitting needles are definitely very high quality. And whenever I do decide to use double pointed knitting needles, these are definitely my best wooden double pointed knitting needles, and I would choose these as my first choice for a DPN. But like I said, I typically go for circulars just because they're so much easier to work with in my opinion. Now, the DPNs come in 5-inch, 6-inch, and 8-inch lengths, so you have multiple options there, and they do come in a wider range of sizes than the circular knitting needles. So I have a set in a very small size here. This is a set of sock needles. They are DPNs, but they are really small size. I don't remember what size these are. I think they're a size 1. But I have knit socks on these and they're very enjoyable to work with. And they do have those rainbow colors in them as well, because this is the rainbow colorway. But these are the 5-inch sock needles, the 5-inch DPNs. And that is one thing that you will need to note about these needles in general, is that if you really enjoy knitting socks and you don't want to use DPNs, then you'll probably want to go for a metal needle, because with the interchangeable circulars, or even the fixed circulars for that matter, those start at a size 4. So if you want a size 1 or a size 2 or even a size 0 in this laminated birch, then you're going to need to go with the DPNs. Otherwise, if you want to use a circular needle for your socks, then you might want to go with some metal knitting needles. And I'll put my recommendation for the best metal knitting needles in the description box below. As far as knitting needles go, last but not least, we have the cable knitting needles, and those are trying to sneak away from me here. These are for knitting cables. And basically what this is a stitch holder with knitting needle tips on it. So the purpose of a cable needle is to hold a few stitches at a time while you're working cables. So when you knit a cable, a lot of times what you'll do is go ahead and slip several stitches onto a cable needle like this one, hold it to the front or to the back of the work, knit the next few stitches with your regular needles, and then take the cable needle and then bring it back up to the front or the back, whichever way you've held it, and then knit the remaining stitches off the cable needle. So the purpose of this is to hold stitches. And you can see how that because of the smooth surface, they've notched actually some little notches into these cable needles, so that when you slide your cable stitches onto this cable needle, the stitches, or I should say the needle, won't fall out of the stitches if they're loose. So that gives it a little bit more texture so that those stitches will stay on there securely while you knit your cable cross. So these come in a set of 3 in different sizes for whatever type of project you're making. And P.S., they actually also make crochet hooks in this laminated birch, and those are awesome. I have a separate video on those if you want to check those out. But since this video is about knitting needles, we won't get into that here. Now, let's go over the color options that are available here. So if you want a plain, neutral colored knitting needle, then you'll want to go for this one. This one is called Sunstruck, and that's the name of this color option here. And it's kind of like an undyed or a very neutral wood tone look. And this is very pretty, but my personal preference is actually the colored ones. So I have a Sunstruck here, and these giant tips here are also in the Sunstruck color category here. Next up we have the Rainbow. And these actually used to be called Harmony, but these are now called Rainbow Wood, and they have rainbow stripes, of course. They don't have like a purple in them, but they have a red, like a berry-colored red, a peachy orange, kind of a royal indigo blue, lime green, and a golden orangey yellow. These are very pretty, and they come with purple cords. Then there's the Caspian colorway, which is teals and greens and blues in a bunch of different shades, and these are also very, very pretty. And then we have the Radiant colorway, which is kind of more of a warm tone with purples and pinks and orange and yellow, and kind of that brightest pink is kind of a reddish pink or a pinkish red. It's kind of like a sunset colorway. And then last but not least, we have the Mosaic. So I'm going to grab one of the larger tips here so you can see that better. This colorway is black with royal blue and several shades of purple with a little bit of a teal aqua color in there, and these are a darker combination, and these are also very pretty. But these come with black cables. So the rainbow colored needles come with purple cords. The Caspian needles, if you get the circular ones, come with green cords that are this color right here. And the Majestic ones come with black cords. I don't have any circular Radiant ones, but I believe they come with purple cords as well. So Knit Picks also makes some really nice cases for their needles, and I'd like to show you those as well, because it's really important if you have a nice quality set of needles to store them properly so they don't get damaged. So both of these right here are the interchangeable knitting needle clutches. This one is for the short needles, and this one is for the regular needles as far as the needle tips. So I'm going to go ahead and move my stuff off of this case so you can see it. The smaller one is exactly the same, but just smaller. So inside the case here, we have slots for all the different sizes of interchangeable circular needle tips. And if you were to buy a full set of these tips, these are the sizes that would come with it. It comes in sizes 4 to 11. And some of mine are actually missing here because they're in projects somewhere. But I actually bought my circular knitting needles here as individual sets of tips over time. So I have some in the Caspian and some in the rainbow, but they do have a set with multiple colorways combined together. Otherwise, the sets are all one colorway. So there's slots in here in the middle for all the different size needles. There's a slip pocket here, so you can stick your pattern in there if you want to. And then here, we have a snap, and I believe this is like vegan suede. And you can stick smaller accessories in this pocket. And then on the front, all my needles are going to roll away here. On the front, this is the inside of the front. We have a zipper pouch here where you can put anything small like these little cord keys that might fall out easily if it wasn't a zipper. So we have our gold zipper there and a magnetic snap so that the case can close just like that. And it looks like a very neat clutch. And on the back, there is another slip pocket on the outside. So like I said, the smaller clutch is exactly the same. It just is smaller. Everything about it is smaller. It has all the same pockets though. I can go ahead and close this one so you can see what it looks like on the outside, but it looks the same as well. So these are my favorite knitting needle cases that I've ever had. I previously had one of their older versions of their case, but this one is my favorite. It's a very nice quality. The vegan suede is very soft. So if you're looking for a very nice quality case that is specifically made for these needles, then I would definitely recommend the needle clutches. But if you don't want to purchase an extra case, the needles actually come with their own vinyl cases. Now, of course, like I said, some of my sizes are missing here because they are being used somewhere in a project in my stash. But the cases are made of this clear vinyl, and they do a just fine job holding all the needles, keeping them protected from moisture and stuff, like if you spilled something on it. And it does have this little piece of cardboard in here so that you know which size is in which slot. Now, this vinyl case is probably at least 6 years old, and it's still just fine. I haven't had any problems with it falling apart or anything. But if you do prefer the nicer quality suede or faux suede cases, then I would definitely recommend going with one of these. Alright, so now let's talk about the all-important subject of pricing. So these needles are actually pretty affordable for a high-quality wooden knitting needle compared to a lot of other brands. That's just kind of something that goes for Knit Picks products in general, but if you kind of price match these compared to other knitting needles of this type of quality, then these are typically more affordable than other brands. Now, it is cheaper per needle set, per needle pair, if you get a full set of the interchangeable circulars, or a full set of anything. If you get it as a full set with lots of sizes, then the price per pair of needles is going to be lower. But if you go for individual sizes of needle tips, the individual pairs of tips only for the interchangeable circulars start at about $7.50. DPNs start at about $8 per set. Straight needles start at about $7.50 per pair, and the fixed circulars start at $9. Now, the full set, if you go for a full set, this full set of 9 sizes of interchangeable circular knitting needles, it comes with several cord lengths and 9 sizes of tips. This set is currently $65.99, but occasionally they do put their needle collection on sale at a slight discount, so you can get them at a slightly lower price than that sometimes. So I've been using these needles, as far as needles from this collection, for over 7 years now. My first ones were these interchangeable circulars, then I added the straight needles, and eventually the short circulars and some of these larger tips here for when I want to use a yarn that's too big for the 11s here, the size 11. But point being, I've been using these needles for over 7 years, and I've always enjoyed working with them. I have tested them against several other similar brands of wooden knitting needles, sometimes even woods that are more exotic than birch, and none of them have really compared to the smooth surface of the Knit Picks needles. Some of the brands that I've tested these against include Knitter's Pride Ginger, We Are Knitters knitting needles, various brands of bamboo, both coated and uncoated, and these have the best smooth surface of all the wooden knitting needles that I've tested. The main thing that differentiates these needles from other brands of wooden knitting needles is that surface friction, because these have the smoothest surface. And even though a lot of other brands, especially of the circular knitting needles, have the same type of cords and a similar type of connector, it's just not the same with the different surfaces. This is the best smooth surface. So if you'd like to try out these needles, price-wise, I would definitely recommend going for a full set of interchangeable circulars. If you're not sure whether these are right for you or not, then you might want to try just ordering a single size of the needles and test them out and see how you like them. And then once you have decided whether they're right for you, then you can go ahead and order the full set if you want to. But if you do want to go ahead and get a full set, I would definitely recommend the interchangeable circular knitting needle set. The longer tips are my preference for most projects, and this will give you enough sizes that you'll have the right knitting needle for most projects that you'll want to make. If you want to do something smaller than a size 4 knitting needle on a circular, then you'll need to go with metal needles instead of the wooden ones. But if you do prefer wooden knitting needles, then this one set will cover most of the projects that you'll want to make. And if you really want to get some larger ones, they have the larger ones too. If you really want to get some smaller ones, they do also make some smaller sized fixed circular knitting needles. But if you do decide to go for a metal knitting needle for your smaller sizes, then check out my recommendation for metal knitting needles in the description below. But if you like to knit socks and you prefer wooden knitting needles, then you'll want to go for the DPNs. So should you buy Knit Picks knitting needles? I think that depends on whether you prefer wooden knitting needles or metal. If wooden knitting needles are your preference, you'll definitely want to check these out. If you're not sure whether you're going to like them or not, you can always just order one size, test them out for a while, and then you can purchase a full set when you're ready. But these are my top pick for wooden knitting needles, so I would definitely recommend giving them a try. Now before we go, I'd like to show you a couple different tricks for using interchangeable knitting needles like these, and they primarily involve this little hole right here. So like I mentioned earlier, some people have a problem with their needle tip coming unscrewed from the cord. But if you just use the little cord key, you'll never have to worry about that, because this, if you insert it into this little hole, gives you something to twist against. So if I screw this on here with my fingers, just finger tighten it, then it has the ability to come unscrewed. But if I have this to twist against, then I can twist it on there tighter so that it won't come undone. And this also helps us take the needles off, because we can untwist them by having something to twist against and take them off. Now another thing that you can use this connection for here is to put your project on hold for later. So these are little end caps, and they have a little screw-on connector here too. So let's say that you're working with these size 11 needles on a project, and you decide that you want to use these for another project, and you want to pause working on your current project for now. All you have to do is unscrew your interchangeable knitting needle tip from the cord, and screw on one of these end caps. The cord key will help you tighten them, but there's one more tip here that you can use. This right here is a size marker tag. So this is basically a little disc of plastic with a size labeling in both US size and millimeter size, and it has a hole in it. So you can slip this on. I will actually do this before I put the cord key in. You would basically scrunch all your stitches onto the cord, slide this little marker on, and then you would insert the cord key into the hole and screw on your end cap. Just make sure you twist it tight enough so it doesn't come undone. And that way, when you come back to this project and you want to put your size 11 needles back on, you'll know what needle size to use. Now, of course, this one says 17. This is just the first one that I grabbed. But if I was using size 11 needles on a project, I could use the marker for size 11, slip that on there, and then when I come back to this project later and go, oh no, I can't remember what needle size I used for this, then you'll know because it's marked right there on your size marking tag. And one more trick that you can use with the little hole in the cable connector is for adding a lifeline. Now, a lifeline is a string that you run through your row of stitches if you're working a complicated stitch pattern, so that if you make a mistake and you don't want to have to try to drop that stitch and then pick it back up to fix it, you can just unravel back to the lifeline. And the easiest way to add a lifeline is to thread the end of your string through that little hole in the cord and then just knit across your row. So that string, of course, you would want to thread it through and then tie it with itself so that it doesn't just slip out. But you would thread it through, tie the end of it to the length of the string, knit across your row, and then it automatically threads the lifeline through your stitches for you. So that's an easy way to add a lifeline using that little hole in your needle cord. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you've tried these needles before, let me know how you like them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.